Naples, March 2008. For nearly half a year, garbage has not been collected from the city streets. The local waste management system has collapsed under years of mismanagement and corruption, and mountains of rotting bags line the sidewalks of one of Italy's most famous cities. Residents tie cloth over their faces to walk past the piles. Then Italian health inspectors make a discovery that shakes the entire dairy industry to its core. Milk samples from water buffalo grazing on farms in the provinces of Caserta and Salerno test positive for dioxin, a highly toxic compound linked to cancer, organ damage, and developmental disorders in children. Word spreads fast. Japan and South Korea immediately suspend all imports of Italian buffalo mozzarella. Domestic sales inside Italy collapse by nearly a third within a matter of weeks. Prosecutors in Naples open a sprawling investigation into more than 100 people on suspicion of fraud and food poisoning. Newspapers run front-page stories asking whether the country's most famous cheese can ever be trusted again. What had actually happened? For years, it turns out the Camorra, the organized crime syndicate that has dominated Naples and its surrounding countryside for generations, have been quietly running a lucrative side business, illegally dumping industrial and toxic waste directly into the farmland where dairy buffalo grazed. Legitimate waste disposal was expensive and heavily regulated. Paying the Camorra to make barrels of chemical sludge disappear overnight was cheaper, faster, and required no paperwork. For more than a decade, that waste was buried in fields, dumped in ditches, or simply set on fire under cover of darkness. The toxins seeped slowly into the soil, into the groundwater, into the grass the buffalo ate, and finally into the milk that became the region's most cherished export. The very landscape that had given Italy its most celebrated cheese had, without most people realizing it, been quietly poisoned for years. How did Italy's finest cheese end up a hostage to organized crime and a garbage crisis? And how did it manage to survive the scandal at all? To answer that, we have to go back almost 1,000 years, long before the Mafia, long before pizza, long before anyone had ever heard the word mozzarella, to the marshlands of southern Italy, where this story begins not with a crime, but with an animal that by most accounts was never even supposed to be there. The water buffalo is not native to Italy, and it never was. Its ancestral homeland lies in South and Southeast Asia, where for thousands of years it served as the primary draft animal in flooded rice paddies, strong enough to pull a plow through standing water that would exhaust an ox. Exactly how and when the animal reached southern Italy is a question historians still argue about, and the honest answer is that no single account has ever been proven beyond dispute. One tradition holds that Arab traders and conquerors brought buffalo through Sicily as early as the 7th century, part of the broader exchange of crops, animals, and techniques that came with Arab expansion across the Mediterranean. Another version credits the Normans, who arrived in southern Italy centuries later and are said to have introduced the animal, or at least expanded its presence, as part of their own agricultural reorganization of the region. A third, more romantic legend claims the buffalo arrived as a gift between rulers. None of these stories can be fully verified, and it is entirely possible that buffalo trickled into the region gradually through several routes, rather than arriving in one dramatic shipment. What is not in dispute is where the animals ended up. The coastal lowlands of Campania, particularly the valleys carved by the Volturno and Seal rivers, which by the 11th century had become vast, waterlogged, mosquito-ridden marshes. For most livestock, that terrain would have been a death sentence. Horses and cattle sink into soft, saturated ground. Their narrow hooves concentrate weight in a way that turns wet earth into a trap. The water buffalo's anatomy solves that problem almost perfectly. Its hooves are wide, splayed, and flat, distributing weight the way a snowshoe does, allowing the animal to walk across mud that would swallow a horse to its knees. Land considered worthless for almost any other form of agriculture turned out to be the perfect home for exactly this one creature. And for centuries, buffalo herding in Campania was inseparable from the brutal, malaria-plagued work of living and laboring in those swamps, work usually left to the poorest farmhands in the region, long before anyone drained the marshes for good in the 20th century. Buffalo milk itself is strikingly different from cow's milk. It contains nearly twice the fat content, along with a different balance of proteins, giving it a heavier body, a brighter white color, and a naturally sweet, faintly tangy flavor. Cheese made from it turns out glossier, creamier, and more elastic than anything made from cow's milk alone. The earliest written record of cheese made this way dates to the 12th century, and it comes not from a merchant's ledger or a royal court, but from a monastery. At San Lorenzo in the town of Capua, in the province of Caserta, Benedictine monks kept a modest, almost invisible tradition. Pilgrims passing through on their way to nearby shrines were given bread and a small piece of fresh cheese, free of charge, as an act of hospitality toward travelers. That cheese was called mozza, from the Italian verb mozzer, to cut or to sever. The name described the method of making it. Hot, elastic curd was stretched and kneaded by hand, almost like bread dough, until it reached the right texture, and then individual portions were pinched or cut off with a quick twist of the fingers. The technique gave the cheese its name before anyone had thought to give it much of anything else. No guild, no market stall, no reputation beyond the walls of one Campanian monastery. This was not pure charity in the modern sense. It also solved a practical problem for the monks. Buffalo grazing on monastery land produced far more milk than the community itself could drink, and turning the surplus into cheese was both a form of preservation and a way of fulfilling the Christian obligation to care for travelers. It is a small, easily overlooked detail of history that the cheese later associated with luxury, glamour, and Italian national pride began as leftover milk turned into free food for exhausted strangers on a dirt road. That modest act of hospitality, not any culinary ambition or commercial plan, is what gave rise to a cheese which, 9 centuries later, would sit on pizzas served from Naples to Nagoya. For several more centuries after that first monastic record, mozzarella remained a strictly local product, virtually unknown outside the province where it was made. It suffered from one fundamental, stubborn flaw that would define its entire history for the next 700 years. It spoiled disastrously fast. Fresh curd cheese with no rind, no salt cure, and no aging process is almost nothing protecting it from bacteria. Cheese made in the morning could already be unsafe to eat by the following evening in the summer heat of southern Italy. That single fact made any kind of long-distance trade essentially impossible. A merchant could not load mozzarella onto a cart and send it to Rome, let alone put it on a ship. It could barely survive the trip from a farm to the nearest town market. By the 14th century, only cheese sturdy enough to survive a short cart ride was making it to the markets of Naples and Salerno at all, and even that remained a small-scale, regional affair rather than anything resembling organized commerce. The word mozzarella itself took even longer to enter the historical record in its own right. The first truly authoritative written use of the term doesn't appear until 1570, in a lavish cookbook titled L'Opera by Bartolomeo Scappi, a celebrated Renaissance chef who had cooked for several Roman popes over the course of his career. Scappi's book, one of the most detailed culinary manuscripts to survive from that era, mentions mozzarella as one ingredient among hundreds used in the elaborate banquets of the papal court. That single mention says a great deal about how far the cheese's reputation had traveled in 4 centuries. From a free handout to weary pilgrims at a rural monastery to an ingredient sophisticated enough to appear on the table of the Pope's own kitchen. And yet, despite that prestigious mention, mozzarella remained rare and largely inaccessible well into the 18th century. Buffalo herds were still small. Milking and cheese-making were done entirely by hand in tiny batches, and the finished cheese was consumed almost exclusively within a day's travel of where it was produced. The real turning point for the industry, the moment mozzarella stopped being a curiosity and started becoming a genuine regional product, came when the Bourbon rulers of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies took a direct interest in buffalo breeding on their royal estates near Caserta in the late 1700s. Under royal patronage, herds expanded, dairies grew more organized, and for the first time something resembling a structured industry began to take shape around the animal and its milk. Only then did a small monastic treat, given away for free to travelers, start turning into a commercial product with an actual market and, eventually, an actual price. By the end of the 19th century, mozzarella had gained an unlikely and hugely consequential ally: pizza. Legend has it that in 1889, a Neapolitan pizzaiolo named Raphael Esposito prepared a pie topped with tomato, basil, and white cheese for Queen Margherita of Savoy during a royal visit to Naples. Its red, white, and green colors deliberately echoing the flag of a country that had only recently been unified. How accurate that particular story really is remains disputed among food historians. It may be more legend than fact, but by the end of the century, Neapolitan pizza topped with fresh mozzarella had genuinely become the city's culinary calling card, sold from small storefronts and street stalls to anyone who could afford a few coins for a slice. The problem, once again, was the same one that had limited the cheese for 7 centuries. It spoiled too quickly to be produced anywhere except within a short distance of a working buffalo dairy. Pizza could travel. Fresh mozzarella, for the most part, could not. The solution to that problem, when it finally arrived, came not from Italy but from the American Midwest, carried there by the very people who had grown up eating the cheese in the first place. Between the 1880s and the 1920s, more than 4 million Italians emigrated to the United States, a huge proportion of them from the poorer regions of the South, including Campania. They brought pizza with them, and by 1905, the first licensed pizzeria in the United States, Lombardi's, had opened on Spring Street in New York's Little Italy. But American cities were nothing like Naples. Distances between suppliers and customers were vast, refrigerated transport was still primitive, and demand kept climbing faster than any fresh cheese supply chain could handle. In the 1930s, dairy producers in the American Midwest, far from the fresh milk farms of Wisconsin's competitors on the coasts, set themselves a very specific engineering goal: create a version of mozzarella firm enough and dry enough to survive days of transport and weeks of storage, while still melting, browning, and stretching the way fresh mozzarella did on top of a hot pizza. Technicians at the Stella Cheese Company, based in the small town of Campbellsport, Wisconsin, cracked the problem by raising the temperature at which the milk was curdled, squeezing more moisture out of the curd, and producing a noticeably firmer, drier, slightly yellow block of cheese compared to the soft, wet mozzarella traditionally made on the East Coast. They also developed a new bacterial culture ratio that cut the entire curdling process down from roughly 3 days to just 1, slashing production costs dramatically. Producers at first simply marketed the new product under the plain, functional name pizza cheese, since demand for it was coming almost entirely from the booming pizza trade. It would take the U.S. Food and Drug Administration until decades later to formally codify the product under its now familiar name, low moisture mozzarella. In practical terms, this invention did for mozzarella something remarkably similar to what hops and high alcohol content had once done for British beer bound for India. It took a fragile, short-lived product and re-engineered it, almost from scratch, into something that could survive a long journey, sit in a warehouse, and last for weeks on a shelf without losing the qualities that made it useful in the first place. It was around this new, shelf-stable product that a genuine industrial empire grew up over the following decades. In 1950, in Denver, Colorado, an Italian immigrant named Mike Leprino Sr. began making mozzarella by hand for his family's small corner grocery store, selling it locally to other Italian-American families in the neighborhood. In the 1960s, his son Jim Leprino traveled to Wisconsin specifically to learn the industrial techniques for producing cheese in 20-pound blocks, teaming up with an experienced cheesemaker named Les Kielmeyer, who brought crucial technical know-how into the growing family business. The timing turned out to be extraordinary. Those same years saw pizza chains multiplying explosively across the American landscape, each one needing a reliable, affordable, and above all consistent supply of cheese. In 1968, Leprino Foods landed a contract that would change the company's trajectory forever, supplying cheese to the newly expanding Pizza Hut chain, which needed a partner capable of delivering standardized, pre-portioned cheese cheaply and at true industrial scale, something none of its existing suppliers could reliably manage. Leprino Foods responded by developing an entirely new process for frozen, pre-shredded mozzarella, eliminating the expensive, labor-intensive step of hand-grating blocks of cheese in every single restaurant kitchen. Where traditional mozzarella aging had taken weeks to develop the right texture and flavor, Leprino's proprietary methods compressed that entire cycle down to a matter of hours through what the company patented as a continuous extrusion process. Later innovations included quality-locked cheese in the 1980s and a patented same-day dice process that flash-froze shredded or diced mozzarella almost immediately after production, locking in freshness for long-distance shipping. Across these decades, the company accumulated more than 50 patents for its manufacturing methods, and by the 1990s, it had become the #1 pizza cheese supplier in the country, eventually supplying Pizza Hut, Domino's, Papa John's, and Little Caesars all at once. Direct competitors who nonetheless depended on the very same cheese supplier behind the scenes. By some industry estimates, Leprino Foods came to control roughly 85% of the entire American market for pizza cheese, along with major operations across Europe, Latin America, and Asia. What began as one immigrant's modest neighborhood grocery had, within 2 generations, turned into a near monopoly industry quietly shaping the taste of pizza for hundreds of millions of people who have never heard the Leprino name and, in all likelihood, have never set foot anywhere near Campania. While low-moisture mozzarella was busy conquering the world as a purely industrial commodity, a very different movement was quietly gathering strength back in Italy, an effort to protect the original, artisanal buffalo mozzarella of Campania from dilution, imitation, and outright counterfeiting by producers cashing in on its growing international reputation. In 1996, the European Union formally granted Mozzarella di Bufala Campana protected designation of origin status, one of the strictest categories of food protection that European law offers. From that point forward, cheese legally entitled to carry the specific name had to be made exclusively from buffalo milk, produced only within precisely defined provinces across Campania, Lazio, Apulia, and Molise, and manufactured according to a traditional method laid out in painstaking bureaucratic detail. Everything from how the curd is stretched to how quickly the finished cheese must be packaged and sold. At first glance, this reads as pure consumer protection, a guarantee that what you're buying is exactly what the label promises. But, in much the same way Bavaria's 1516 beer purity law mixed genuine quality standards with the Duke's own economic interests, plain protectionism sat quietly behind the language of quality here too. Regional producers within the protected zone gained an effective monopoly on the most prestigious and expensive name in the entire category, while cheesemakers from other parts of Italy and from other countries entirely were cut out of that lucrative market by, quite literally, a handful of words permitted on a label. Today, the protected buffalo mozzarella sector is worth somewhere around 300 million euros a year on its own, with roughly 33,000 tons produced annually and close to a fifth of that total exported abroad, largely to other parts of Europe as well as Japan and Russia. A law written into European regulation explicitly as a guarantee of authenticity and quality has, at the very same time, functioned as a highly effective instrument of trade protectionism, exactly the role the Bavarian beer decree once played for German brewers 500 years earlier, just dressed in the modern language of geographic indication rather than royal decree. It was precisely this protected, and therefore especially valuable, status that made buffalo mozzarella an attractive target for people looking to profit from its reputation dishonestly. And this is arguably the least discussed and darkest chapter in the cheese's entire thousand-year history. From the 1990s onward, the fertile plains around Naples, the very same marshland that had once welcomed the first buffalo centuries earlier, quietly became one of the largest illegal dumping grounds in Europe. Industrial waste from factories across northern and central Italy, where legal disposal was expensive and closely regulated, was trucked south under Camorra control and either buried directly in agricultural fields or set alight in open-air fires under cover of night. For over a decade, this went on largely unchecked. The region earned a grim, almost literary nickname among locals and journalists alike: Terra dei Fuochi, the land of fires. Soil and groundwater contamination that had built up quietly for years finally became impossible to ignore in 2008 when dioxin from that poison land worked its way into buffalo milk, and from the milk into a cheese that Italians had long regarded as a symbol of honest, natural, almost pastoral rural labor. Contaminated soil, however, was far from the only problem eating away at the industry from within. The sheer scarcity and premium price of genuine buffalo mozzarella created an obvious and constant temptation toward outright fraud. Repeated inspections by the Italian Ministry of Agriculture found that a meaningful share of cheese sold under the protected label was in fact partly or entirely made with far cheaper cow's milk quietly substituted for buffalo milk. In some tested batches, the adulteration reportedly reached as high as 30% of the total content. A serious breach, given that authentic protected designation status legally requires the product to be 100% buffalo milk. The story reached its most dramatic public climax in 2012, when Italian police arrested the head of one of the country's largest buffalo mozzarella companies, a businessman who had once flamboyantly described himself in an interview as the Armani of Mozzarella. The resulting investigation uncovered not only his company's alleged financial ties to a Naples organized crime clan, reportedly stretching back to a bailout the business received during a financial crisis in the 1980s, but also a systematic, long-running practice of quietly substituting cow's milk for buffalo milk and selling ordinary provolone cheese relabeled as a far more expensive variety. Investigators seized company assets reportedly worth more than 100 million euros in a single operation. An industry whose entire public image rested on honest rural tradition had, for decades, been quietly hollowed out from the inside by exactly the kinds of forces the origin protection system had been designed, at least on paper, to guard against. And yet, after each of these scandals, the industry did not simply collapse. It responded, adapted, and in some ways strengthened its own defenses. The consortium of buffalo mozzarella producers across Campania tightened laboratory testing protocols, introduced far stricter traceability systems, tracking milk from a specific farm all the way to a specific finished batch of cheese, and poured resources into public awareness campaigns aimed at reassuring both domestic and international customers that the product remains safe. Alongside these institutional reforms, recent decades have also seen the rise of an almost opposite impulse: a renewed international appetite for genuinely artisanal, small-batch cheese made entirely by hand, produced as close as possible to the way the monks of San Lorenzo once made it 9 centuries ago. Small, family-run caseifeci scattered across the Campanian countryside now ship mozzarella by air to restaurants around the world, cheese that is stretched and shaped by hand within hours of milking and meant to be eaten that same day or, at the very latest, the next. Out of that same tradition of skilled, handwork curd came one of mozzarella's most celebrated descendants, burrata, a comparatively recent invention dating only to the early 20th century in the neighboring region of Apulia, in which a thin outer shell of mozzarella is filled with fresh cream and shredded scraps of leftover curd, producing a texture so soft it is often eaten with a spoon straight out of its wrapping. The idea, according to local tradition, grew out of Apulian cheesemakers' habit of never wasting the stringy leftover bits of stretched curd, folding them into cream instead of throwing them away, turning what was essentially kitchen scrap into one of Italian cheesemaking's most luxurious modern exports. Meanwhile, on the industrial side of the business, companies like Leprino Foods have kept expanding globally, forming joint ventures in Western Europe, opening offices across Asia, and partnering with South American producers to bring mass-market mozzarella to markets that had never previously had reliable access to it. So, 8 centuries after a monastery's small act of charity, and nearly a century after the invention of industrial dry mozzarella for American pizzerias, 2 almost opposite traditions, global mass industry on one side, painstaking local craft on the other, now exist side by side, serving 2 entirely different ideas of what this cheese is even supposed to be. Today, it would be hard to find a more contradictory food product anywhere in the world. On one side stands low-moisture mozzarella, manufactured on enormous, fully automated production lines, topping billions of pizzas served every year across dozens of countries, having never come anywhere near an actual Italian water buffalo. On the other side stands cheese still made almost entirely by hand on the marshy plains of Campania, using techniques barely distinguishable from what monks were applying 1,000 years earlier, only now operating under the constant watch of European inspectors and laboratories testing every batch for dioxin residue and cow's milk adulteration. Remarkably, both of these radically different versions of mozzarella trace back to precisely the same modest monastic gesture in the 12th century: a piece of bread and a small portion of matzah, given without charge to a tired pilgrim passing through Capua on a dusty road. The 2008 crisis in Naples that opened this story did not, in the end, destroy the industry, as many feared at the time and as some competitors quietly hoped it might. Within a matter of months of the dioxin scandal breaking, Italian producers had demonstrated the safety of the vast majority of their product through independent testing. The Japanese and South Korean import bans were lifted, and sales gradually recovered across both domestic and export markets. The organized crime network that had poisoned the land purely for short-term profit ultimately failed to permanently destroy the reputation of a cheese built up over centuries of genuinely honest agricultural labor. Water buffaloes still graze today in the valleys of the Volturno and Seal, largely unaware of the scandals fought over their milk. Small family dairies across Campania still stretch hot curd entirely by hand, exactly the way the cheese's own name has instructed for 900 years, Mozzer, to cut off. And thousands of miles away, on production floors in Denver or rural Wisconsin, conveyor belts continue turning out block after block of essentially the same basic product. Cheese born not from any monastery's quiet act of charity, but from the entirely modern logistics problem of feeding an enormous, endlessly hungry American pizza industry. One cheese, tracing back to a single 12th century act of hospitality, has ended up living two entirely separate lives on opposite sides of the planet. And both of those lives began with nothing more than an animal that simply knew how to walk across a marsh without sinking.